The hidden price of pleasure in the modern world, the hidden trap of instant pleasure. You've spent most of your life chasing the light, trying to be good, kind, positive, strong. But what if the part of you you've been running from is the very part that holds the key to your healing? In this video, we enter the inner world of Robert A. Johnson, a Jungian thinker who believed that real transformation doesn't come from perfection, but from embracing what's been hidden. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about reclaiming what you've denied: your feelings, your instincts, your shadow. Because you don't become whole by shining brighter. You become whole when you dare to step into the dark and listen. Stay with us. Because deep within the shadow, beneath the parts you've rejected, lies the most powerful force of all, the self you were always meant to become. When light isn't enough, the awakening journey of Robert A. Johnson. To honor and accept one's own shadow is a profound spiritual discipline. It creates wholeness, and thus it is sacred. Robert A. Johnson was not only a Jungian analyst, he was a man who glimpsed the golden world during a near-death experience at the age of 11, a world with no light, no form, yet overflowing with inner ecstasy. When he awoke, the real world felt so harsh and meaningless that he no longer wanted to live. During therapy, he was reminded, without the human body, he would never have been able to see the beauty he had touched. From that moment, Robert began to live, but not to conquer the world. He lived to return inward. Upon meeting Carl Jung, he was advised, live in solitude, devote a sacred space for inner work. Don't concern yourself with achieving anything in life. Jung told him, the unconscious will take care of you. Your only task is to do the inner work. Everything else will follow. And so it did. After years adrift in confusion, he once again encountered the golden world in India, not in some distant realm, but in a single moment as he looked out a window. Healing doesn't come from the outside world. It arrives when we become still enough to realize that the light has always been there. We just haven't been looking in the right direction. Who is the shadow within you? Understanding the shadow, according to Jung, in a world that constantly urges us to become our best selves, strong, radiant, likable, there is a vital part of us that gets forgotten, the shadow. Carl Jung called it the shadow, not to label it evil, but to describe what has been cut off from consciousness. The shadow is not your enemy. It is simply the part of you that remains unseen. The shadow is not outside of you. It is you. It is the mirror opposite of everything you know yourself to be. If you're extroverted, the shadow might be the deep inner life you avoid. If you live to please others, your shadow might be a defiant voice longing to live authentically. Jung taught that the shadow serves as a counterweight to the self, a place where you've sacrificed emotions, needs, dreams, just to fit the image that society expects. The shadow of an aggressive person might be a buried tenderness. The shadow of someone timid might be a courage never allowed to surface. We often think the shadow is dangerous because it makes us feel different, worse. But it's the rejection of the shadow that turns it threatening. Every time you suppress your true feelings to keep a calm image, you don't dissolve the shadow, you simply store another layer of data into the unconscious. One day it will return, as irrational anger, exhaustion, or a strange sense of no longer being yourself. The shadow is the part of you you haven't yet had the courage to face, but it also carries truth, vitality, and the deepest capacity for healing. You cannot become your full self until you've looked into what you've tried to hide. The parts you reject and how they accumulate into destiny. Nothing within you ever truly disappears, even when you try to deny it. The emotions you never acknowledged, the desires once crushed, the traits you were told shouldn't exist, none of them vanish. They're simply pushed into the dark, into what Jung called the shadow. Every culture, every family, every environment draws an invisible map of what's acceptable. Children learn quickly what earns them love and what earns them rejection. They begin cutting away parts of themselves to fit the mold set by society. But the cost is inner fragmentation. Jung called this the splitting of the self, when one part of the psyche is hidden so the other can survive. The things we disown, anger, grief, instinct, desire, even creativity or pride, don't go away. They continue to live a separate life in the dark. And over time, they begin shaping our behavior, beyond the control of our conscious mind. The more we reject the shadow, the more powerful it becomes. It can rise up as unexplained rage, a sudden depression, or self-destructive choices we can't rationalize. The scariest part? We often don't realize it's us. We don't recognize that we're screaming the pain we once silenced. We think we're losing control, when in fact it's the abandoned part of us trying to speak. If you don't recognize what you've rejected, it will quietly rewrite the story of your life without you even knowing. Not only darkness, the shadow also hides your light. We often think the shadow contains only the bad stuff: anger, envy, selfishness, hatred. But according to Robert Johnson and Carl Jung, the opposite is also true. The shadow also holds the best parts of you that you've never dared to live. Strange as it sounds, your brightest traits, courage, talent, charm, noble character, may also be buried in the dark because they were once mocked, shamed, or didn't fit the mold others set for you. Johnson wrote, "People resist the noble side of the shadow more fiercely than its dark side. Why? Because light comes with responsibility. Because to admit your strength is to stop blaming and start living truthfully. Some hide their kindness for fear of seeming weak. Some bury their creativity to avoid comparison. Some lie small because their light might make others uncomfortable. So the shadow is not just a place of wounds. It becomes the vault of abandoned potential. If you've ever felt exhausted, uninspired, empty, it may not be because you're lacking something, but because you've been living without the best part of yourself, the part you forgot or never gave yourself permission to express. The shadow doesn't only hurt us, it holds the strength we've never unlocked. The thing you fear most within you might be exactly what you need to become whole. The collective shadow. When a society rejects itself, the shadow isn't just individual. A whole society can cultivate its own shadow when collective emotions, needs, or instincts are suppressed, denied, or avoided. When a culture worships total positivity, images of happiness, success, politeness, and kindness, but allows no room for weakness, pain, anger, or raw instincts, those disowned parts don't disappear. They accumulate in the collective unconscious and eventually erupt as violence, prejudice, war, moral collapse, or societal crisis. Robert Johnson warned, "The more a society tries to live in absolute light, the more dangerous its collective shadow becomes." You can see it in today's headlines: war, political division, bigotry, cruelty, not coming from others, but from a shared shadow humanity refuses to confront. When individuals don't accept their own shadow, they project it onto others, believing that those people out there are evil, dangerous, shameful. But the truth is, what we hate in others is often what we haven't accepted in ourselves. That's why self-awareness is not a personal luxury, it's a collective responsibility. Every person who heals their own shadow is contributing to the healing of our shared shadow. If you've ever felt the world is chaotic, unjust, brutal, start from within. There can be no peace in the world if there's still war in each mind. One-sided living, the cost of only living in the light. Everyone wants to be seen as a good person. That's why many spend their entire lives constructing a perfect mask, kind, moral, compassionate, optimistic. But behind that absolute brightness lies a quiet exhaustion. Robert Johnson used the image of a seesaw to describe the human psyche. On one side are the socially accepted traits: honesty, cheerfulness, humility. On the other side are what's considered wrong: anger, pride, jealousy, desire. And anyone who lives only on one side of that seesaw will, sooner or later, lose their psychological balance. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you do good. In fact, the more you strive for perfection, the more the disowned parts will find a way to break through. An overly polite person might suddenly explode in anger over something trivial. Someone who's overly patient might lose themselves in silent resentment. We assume that trying to be good is enough. But living only in the light isn't healing, it's avoidance. And the price is emotional dryness, spiritual emptiness, or worse, an inner rebellion that leaves you unrecognizable to yourself. You cannot live as half a person. Wholeness does not come from choosing the light and rejecting the dark, but from daring to stand in the middle, where opposites exist together and are seen with compassion. That is where true healing begins. The healing paradox. When light only has meaning alongside darkness in life, we often assume that sacredness is synonymous with purity, that to be good we must eliminate the bad, rid ourselves of sadness, anger, instinct, and desire. But Carl Jung and many ancient wisdom traditions teach the opposite. Holiness is not the absence of darkness, but the integration of light and dark into one living whole. Robert Johnson called this the healing paradox, because if you only want the light, you are uprooting your own inner balance. To be creative, you must also embrace destruction. To love fully, you must accept vulnerability and pain. Just like the sun and its shadows, every act of light will cast a shadow. It's unavoidable. We don't need to fight the shadow, we need to learn how to talk to it. In Eastern mythology, the creator god Brahma is always accompanied by Shiva, the god of destruction, and only with Vishnu, the preserver, sitting between them to maintain balance, can the world continue to exist. Likewise, we can only become psychologically whole when we learn to walk the middle path between our inner extremes, between our inner light and inner darkness. Paradox is not suffering, it is the deeper truth of life. There is no trait that is purely good or purely bad. When you learn to live with paradox, you no longer need to become anything. You return to your most natural state, where healing comes not from forcing change, but from acceptance and compassion for yourself. The shadow needs to be heard, not punished. When the shadow is ignored, it doesn't disappear. It simply finds another way to exist, often by hijacking your behavior without your awareness. You become easily irritable, impatient, reactive, then turn around and blame yourself, wondering why you're not acting like yourself. But the truth is, this isn't deviation, it's a voice trying to be heard. Robert Johnson shared a personal experience. After days of trying to be polite with difficult guests, he thought he had succeeded in maintaining his patient image. But when he stopped by a nursery to reward himself with a plant, he unexpectedly lashed out in a harsh argument with the seller. His shadow, the pent-up irritation, had found an exit, but it was a clumsy, shameful one. We often project our shadow onto others, criticizing, mocking, or resenting people who reflect the very traits we suppress in ourselves. This is how the shadow lives without being acknowledged. But the result is that we never understand ourselves, and we never truly forgive others. The shadow doesn't need you to control it. It needs to be received, understood, and given a safe form of expression. That might be journaling, creating art, crying in private, or simply voicing something you've always kept silent. Healing doesn't come from eliminating the dark, but from transforming it into something felt, understood, and guided by consciousness. And sometimes that starts with a simple question: what is my shadow trying to say to me right now? The Mandorla, where opposites meet and healing begins in classical symbolism, there is a lesser-known yet deeply transformative image. The Mandorla, an almond-shaped space formed where two circles overlap. One circle represents light, the other darkness. Where they meet is the sacred space of healing, where conflict becomes harmony. Robert Johnson viewed the Mandorla as a spiritual symbol of inner reconciliation, not through elimination, but through inclusion. Just as in Christian art, Christ and the Virgin Mary are often placed at the center of the Mandorla, a symbol of union between the divine and the earthly, between the holy and the human. In psychological life, the Mandorla appears when we stop running from our opposites, when a strong person admits they need protection, when a kind person dares to say no, when an introvert learns to open their heart. At that intersection, there is no absolute right or wrong, only truth, seen in the clearest light. Most profound of all, the Mandorla doesn't occur outside, but within you. It's when you're brave enough not to take sides, not to reject half of yourself, but to invite both parts to sit down together. It might be a quiet moment after crisis, a tearful breath that somehow brings peace, a moment when you look back at your wounds and stop blaming. The Mandorla is not comfortable, but it's the only place where true healing lives, where darkness is not banished and light is no longer arrogant, but both are held with honesty and tenderness. You don't need to be right, you need to be whole. We grow up in a world that constantly pushes us to be right, morally right, socially appropriate, aligned with expectations. But in the inner journey, Robert A. Johnson emphasizes, healing doesn't come from being right, it comes from daring to be whole. Within each of us is a seesaw. One side holds the traits we accept and take pride in, the other contains the parts we've rejected. If one side is too heavy and the other too light, we live in constant imbalance. This imbalance not only harms us, it fractures our relationships. The more we strive to be right, the more we fear being wrong. The more we fear being wrong, the more we suppress the most alive parts of ourselves, our real feelings, instincts, reactions. But Johnson reminds us, every human quality deserves recognition, even anger, desire, selfishness, or weakness. No part of the soul can be truly eliminated. The extreme side of light, being overly kind, overly tolerant, overly polite, can provoke a backlash from the shadow. Eventually, we no longer recognize ourselves, burnt out, short-tempered, behaving in ways that betray our values. The key isn't control, it's acceptance of your dual nature. Not to excuse wrongdoing, but to understand that being human means holding both light and shadow, consciousness and the unconscious. When we stop trying so hard to get it right and start reclaiming wholeness, that is when true healing begins. Because only when you can hold both sides of yourself can you live fully and sustainably. When the ego collapses, the birth of the true self begins. We often believe we know exactly who we are, but most of what we call myself is actually a collection of roles. The good one, the strong one, the helpful one, the self-sacrificing one. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask handed to us by society, which we learn to wear in order to be loved and accepted. But at some point, that mask no longer fits. Life begins to crack, crisis, disorientation, the loss of meaning. We feel as though we're falling apart. And it's precisely in that moment, when the ego can no longer maintain control, that the true self begins to speak. Robert A. Johnson referred to this as the necessary collapse of the ego. Not a failure, but a transformation. When all our previous definitions fall apart, when there are no more roles left to play, we are forced to return to our most primal, undivided self, the part that was never defined, never accepted, but has always been the nucleus of our inner life. This is the journey of individuation, the path of returning to an I no longer defined by societal standards, but guided by deep inner intuition. A self that doesn't need to be perfect or right, only real. In times of chaos, the ego will resist. It does not want to lose control. But if we are patient, if we allow the ego to dissolve without collapsing with it, something sacred will begin to form. A self no longer based on expectations, but on lived, authentic experience. That's when you no longer need to become someone. You simply become yourself, in a way no one ever taught you. And it is from that breaking point that the true self is born. From chaos to awakening, the ultimate meaning of the mandala symbol. In our most chaotic moments, when we no longer know who we are, where we're going, or why we're even living, we touch a strange emptiness. Everything that once seemed important suddenly feels meaningless. But this is not the end. It is the beginning of awakening. Carl Jung called this the starting point of individuation, the journey back to our whole self. And one of the most sacred symbols of this journey is the mandala, a perfectly symmetrical circle representing the wholeness of the soul. Across many cultures, the mandala symbolizes the inner universe, a visual image of the self, the deepest I beyond ego. In Tibetan tradition, mandalas are used for meditation, not to find answers, but to remember that we never truly lost our real self, only forgotten it. Robert A. Johnson believed, only by moving through chaos, disintegration, by facing the shadow and embracing paradox, can we truly mature enough to realize that we don't need to become anyone, we only need to become whole. And the mandala represents exactly that. It is not a closed circle, but a sacred space where all fragments of the self are called home and reunited, where light and shadow no longer oppose, but coexist as part of life itself. You don't need to search far to find a mandala. Every time you accept a rejected part of yourself, every time you suspend judgment to truly understand another, you are drawing a living mandala through the maturing of your soul. And that is the mark of an awakened consciousness. Pain is not meant to be avoided. It is a call to go within. No one wants to feel pain. But what Robert A. Johnson and many depth psychologists have shown us is this: pain is often the first doorway back to the inner self. We try everything to avoid pain, diving into work, becoming addicted to relationships, immersing ourselves in entertainment, materialism, even spiritual bypassing. But the more we run, the more pain finds new ways to return: insomnia, anxiety, fatigue, uncontrolled anger, or a silent emptiness we can't name. In analytical psychology, pain is the soul's signal that the shadow has been denied for too long. It is not punishment, it is a call. Look again, something in you needs to be heard. Sometimes it's only when we hit rock bottom, after loss, heartbreak, or existential collapse, that we return to what truly matters inside us. That is when the Mandorla appears, where shadow and light touch, where we are no longer victims, but pilgrims on the healing path. So pause when you feel pain. Don't try to get over it too quickly. Stay for a moment. Ask where it comes from. What part of you has been abandoned? It might be there, right in the heart of your ache, that you discover what you've long been searching for: a self that is honest, whole, and no longer needs to prove anything to this world. No one is evil. They are carrying an unhealed shadow. There are people who hurt us. There are behaviors that outrage us. There are people who seem to carry only darkness. But if we look more deeply, through the lens of Jungian psychology, the truth may not be so simple. Robert A. Johnson emphasized, every person carries a shadow, and when that shadow goes unhealed, it will eventually manifest as manipulation, rage, control, deceit, even violence. But that is not their essence. It is the expression of a part of them in pain, abandoned, and never shown how to be heard. When someone fails to recognize their shadow, they project it onto others. They see evil outside themselves. Unaware, it reflects an unintegrated part within, and we're no different. Every time we judge someone too quickly or react too strongly, it's likely that our own shadow is speaking. Collective healing cannot happen if we keep dividing the world into good people and bad people. The truth is, those who have never healed are most likely to hurt others. Not because they're evil, but because they are living in unconsciousness. And as Jung said, the unconscious rules our fate until we dare to become conscious. So the final step in shadow work is not a brilliant flash of light, but the light of compassion. The ability to look at someone and say, they are suffering under a shadow no one ever helped them see. And when we understand that, we not only begin to forgive others, but also ourselves. And in that forgiveness, the world begins to heal, not through ideals, but through understanding. Not through morality, but through awareness. Not through judgment, but through love.